Hello, and welcome to the Science of TerraGenesis, the podcast about the real science behind terraforming and hominizing other planets, and what it will really take to transform Mars into a new Earth. My name is Alexander Winn. I'm the creator of the indie video game TerraGenesis, which is all about hominizing and terraforming other planets. It came out on iOS in the summer of 2016, and then it came out on Android in the spring of 2018, and we're coming to Windows in just a couple of weeks. So, ever since TerraGenesis first came out, one of the things that players have really responded to is how much real science there is. You know, TerraGenesis isn't just about building cities on some generic red rock. We use the real map of Mars. We use real atmospheric stats and real methods of terraforming. And people have often said, I would love more information around what is real in the game and what was just done for gameplay and that sort of thing. And I never miss an opportunity to talk and geek out about space. And so this podcast is our opportunity to connect with the fans and talk about what would really go into terraforming another planet and really dive deep into what is behind the gameplay. The podcast, as we've conceived of it, has about 16 episodes right now, and we're interested in getting your feedback because we want to figure out what is the right mix of talking about the game versus talking about real science disconnected from the game at all. I could see the podcast going either way, and I'd be very interested in hearing your thoughts. So definitely leave a review on iTunes or anywhere that you get your podcasts, and let us know what you think. For the next few episodes, what we're going to do is kind of orient you in the world of the Science of TerraGenesis. And so this first episode is called Origin Story. And this is about how did TerraGenesis happen, and who am I, anyway? And why am I talking about this, and who cares? So if you're only interested in the science and you don't really have any loyalty to the game, you can probably go ahead and skip the first episode or two and get into when we start talking about the different metrics, starting with surface temperature. But if you're interested in the game TerraGenesis or just getting to know your host, then stick around for this episode, Origin Story. So like I said, my name is Alexander Winn, and I launched TerraGenesis in 2016. I was an indie developer, and I made it all in my spare time. I had a go-into-the-office programming job, and I had always had personal projects, different apps that I was making just in my free time. And TerraGenesis was actually the 25th app that I put on the App Store. And I had always thought that somebody was going to make a game about terraforming. I had always been fascinated by the idea of terraforming. And I had first been introduced to it in a game from the late 90s called Alpha Centauri. And Alpha Centauri was a sci-fi spin-off of the Civilization series of games. And it had very similar mechanics. You build cities, you build armies, and you go and you conquer the other factions. But there were a few things that were different about Alpha Centauri. One of them was that the factions weren't nationalities. You're not playing as the Russians and the Americans and the Chinese or whatever. You're playing based on ideology. So the 7 factions each have a different view of the way the world ought to be, which was an interesting idea. And then one of the other things that was different about Alpha Centauri was terraforming, was the idea that you've landed on this alien planet and you can change it. There were whole units called formers that were specifically dedicated to altering the terrain. So you could clear out the native life, you could plant earth life, you could do the opposite, you could raise mountains and lower them, you could add rivers and do all sorts of stuff. You could raise and lower the sea level. You could really transform the surface of this planet as part of gameplay. And that fascinated me. And I still play Alpha Centauri, and it's 20 years later. But I especially got into that idea of transforming the landscape. And after that, I also encountered a book series called the Mars Trilogy. This is Red Mars, Green Mars, and Blue Mars, written by Kim Stanley Robinson. And this trilogy of books takes you from the initial people to land on Mars and build the first settlement there, all the way through centuries of history, both terraforming the planet, but also culturally transforming it as different waves of immigrants come in from different countries on Earth and help to shape what will be the future society on Mars. And Robinson did such an incredible job of painting terraforming as not just like numbers on a graph or even something as simple as raising and lowering a mountain range. Simple. But he painted it as this ongoing effort by everyone on the planet, and he really drove home how complicated it is. And again, I was so fascinated by this idea, and it seemed to me obvious that someone would make a game based on this idea, because terraforming is all about balance. It's what I often call Goldilocks gameplay. It's a planet that's too hot is no better than a planet that's too cold. You need something right in the middle. Too much oxygen is no better than too little oxygen. You need something right in the middle. And when you have a balancing mechanic like that, that's a game. That's gameplay. So I always thought that somebody would make this game, but the few games that actually had terraforming, it was always kind of a push-button thing. You know, you could play Master of Orion, and you can land on a planet, and then you can terraform it, but the terraforming is just like, do that. It will take 7 turns and cost 500 gold, and now your planet is terraformed. The act of terraforming itself wasn't a part of gameplay, which always seemed like such a missed opportunity. Ever since Alpha Centauri really showed kind of what you could do with it, it seemed like nobody was picking up the baton. But at the same time, I didn't think that I was going to make that game because I wasn't getting into the game industry. My passion at the time, and the time that I'm talking about is when I was in high school, I was going to be a filmmaker. And at the time, I had my first sort of brush with success when I made a Halo 2 machinima series called The Codex. And The Codex blew up. We got over 90 million hits. I was interviewed on MTV and NPR, of all things. And it was really looking like film was going to take off. So I did The Codex, and it was this wild ride, and then I went off to USC Film School. And while I was there, I taught myself how to make websites. And it was largely so I could keep making The Codex, because I wanted to keep posting episodes and that sort of thing, and I wanted to continue expanding the community. So I continued learning how to make websites. And learning how to make websites gradually turned into learning how to make web apps, and learning how to make web apps gradually turned into learning how to make mobile apps. And before I knew it, I was working at a day job as a app developer. And I worked for a number of companies, but I was always working on these personal project apps, just these little quick, make them in an afternoon or a weekend and toss them up on the App Store kind of apps. And finally, one day I looked up and I was like, that game about terraforming that I keep saying somebody ought to make, I think I could make that. I think I could actually do that now. And so I started playing around with it, and that game ultimately became TerraGenesis. And the whole time, I kept thinking back to Alpha Centauri, and especially to the Mars trilogy, because that sense of the reality, the real challenges, that was a big part of what I wanted to capture in the game, was, these things aren't simulated problems. These are real problems that somebody's going to have to actually grapple with, so let's see how you can do. That sense of reality really captivated me. So at the time, I was engaged to my then fiance, and we took a trip to New Zealand for just a couple of weeks. And while we were there, we kept meeting Americans who were there on what's called a working holiday visa, which is where you can go for up to a year, and you can get jobs to pay your way. But the trick is that if you're an American, you have to do it before you're 30. And we were both 29 at the time. And we were planning our wedding, and we were going to get married in April, and then I was going to turn 30 that September. So my fiance and I made the crazy and awesome decision to move to New Zealand immediately after we got married. And we ended up staying there for about 8 months, and it was during that time that I released TerraGenesis on the App Store. And, it was my 25th app. It was not something that I was expecting to completely take off or anything like that. I had actually already moved on to my next project by the time it went up on the App Store. And all of a sudden, things went nuts. And I suddenly found myself working on my 11-inch MacBook Air, trying to fix bugs and push up updates on hotel Wi-Fi and all sorts of stuff, just to keep this game going. We moved back to the United States, and my wife stepped in and said, you are spending so much time on this game that you don't actually have time to like talk to the lawyers and get this set up as a company and do hiring and that sort of thing. So she stepped in to take over a lot of the company functions so that I could continue growing the product. And from there, it just grew and grew and grew. We ended up signing up with a publisher and hiring some developers, and now Edgeworks is a 7-person company and continuing to grow. And it's all built on the success of TerraGenesis. So I really just want to make this podcast both to give me an opportunity to talk about science and space and the things that I love, but also as a thank you to the fans, because the idea of a game based on real science and math was not one that a lot of people expected to really take off. We talked to all sorts of people who were just blown away by the idea that this science game was like, there's no blasting, there's no exciting aliens or anything like that. It's really just a game about math and physics. And I just can't say how grateful I am to all the players for making this happen. So we've got a really cool podcast lined up. We're going to be talking to some experts. We're going to be doing some interviews. We're going to be delving into different aspects of gameplay. And then we're also going to be veering away from the game entirely and just talking about what is it going to take to land people on Mars, to build permanent settlements on Mars, and ultimately to terraform Mars, because a lot of people have ideas about what is going to go into that. And, a lot of research has been done, and there's a lot to think about. So I really hope that you all enjoy this podcast. If you do, please leave a review on iTunes or wherever you're listening to this podcast. I can't say how helpful it is for indie developers for their apps and for podcasters for their podcasts. Please leave a good review. If you don't like the podcast, please forget everything I just said and don't leave a review. It's really not important. We've got pages that you can follow on Facebook and Twitter, Instagram and Reddit. We're all over the place. We've got a Discord channel. We are available at edgeworksentertainment.com and terragenesisgame.com. And of course, TerraGenesis is available on iOS and Android. It's a free download, and it's coming soon to Windows. Thank you to everybody who listened to this first episode. I'm so excited. Definitely let me know what you think and what you would be interested in hearing about. And as always, happy terraforming.